Rocco Buttiglione, and we are very eager to listen to his word. The title, which appears in the program, in the booklet, is Dignity of Labor in a Dramatic Changing Work Environment. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. I see that very few of us have remained until the end, and this encourages me to set aside the text I have prepared. If you want, you can read it, of course, and to give you, in a more familiar way, some impressions that I have that correspond not so much to the text that I have prepared, but rather to the text I would like to write after having listened to all of you. I imagine that this is a common experience after such a rich and engaging exchange of opinions, of views, of so many important experts coming from different countries, from different intellectual careers and experience. Every one of us probably would rewrite the paper he has written in a different way. And frankly, I think that I have learned a lot. Nevertheless, I tell you something on me. I was a student, a friend of Don Luigi Giussani, and who was the founder of a very important Catholic movement here in Italy. And when we gathered, the Spaniards would say the cupola, the leading group, we talked about things, talking about what should be done. And always Don Giussani, methodologically, reproposed the problem with a different question, not what should be done, but where is the subject? Where is the subject that is adequate to the task? Because if we see what should be done, but we have no idea of who should do that, then we run the risk of becoming exceedingly abstract. Who is the subject? Where is the subject? How can we find the subject that is adequate for the task? And listening, it came to my mind, two kinds of subjects. In the history of the Western world, I could say of the world, but it is more prudent to say of the Western world, we have two kinds of subjects that might have a pivotal role. The first of them is the workers' movement. Let us stop for one moment on the idea of workers' movement. The workers' movement has played a fundamental role in our history until it collapsed, it failed. A fellow countryman of our Argentinian friends, Alberto Metol-Ferré, once made a periodization of the history of the workers' movement. There is a first moment in the history of the workers' movement in which the workers' movement is Christian. Weitling, Das Evangelium des armen Sünders, the gospel of a poor sinner. No, already the title of the main work of Weitling tells us the inspiration that he has. The existing society is confronted with the message of the gospel, and the change, the social change that is proposed derives explicitly from the reading of the gospel. Then you have a second wave. It is a second wave in which the predominant element is rather an anarchist element, Proudhon. Here the idea is not the gospel, but rather it is the idea of justice. We want justice. And justice is considered as something that is independent from religion and even opposed to religion. In the name of justice, the anarchists are extremely anti-clerical. There is a strong opposition to the Catholic Church. In the revolution of 1848 in Paris, the Catholic bishop was murdered, among other things. And nevertheless, the best criticism of Proudhon was offered by Karl Marx. He wrote a book, the only book he wrote in French, La misère de la philosophie. In this book, Marx explains, after all, Proudhon is not an atheist. He wants to be an atheist, but he does not succeed. He's not. He's a priest. He uses a word that is more with a particular undertone of despise, not priester, pfaffe. He's a priest because you cannot have absolute justice if you do not have a God. Absolute justice is an adjective. It needs a subject. It is an adjective of God. And then comes a third stage in the history of the workers' movement. It is the Marxian stage. It is atheist. The criterion to criticize the existing social order is not absolute justice, much less the message of Jesus Christ. It is an immanent criterion in the development of the productive forces. It is historical materialism. The productive forces, in time, will become incompatible with the existing social order, and the proletarians will be united through the necessity to make a revolution in order not to die. The existing system cannot offer the possibility of survival to the vast masses of the expropriated. And they will make the revolution. The unity of the workers' movement is not the result of a common idea of justice, much less of a common religious inspiration. It is the result of a direct, immediate need. We all know what the end was. The crisis of the capitalist system did not come about, and the unity created on a materialistic basis did not work. The terrible problem of communism was that people were not united, and they could be compelled to act as if they were part of a community only through sheer and brutal use of force. And then the crisis of communism came, and when the crisis of communism came, it came because there was a great workers' movement, a new workers' movement. It was Solidarność in Poland. And the new workers' movement was a workers' movement whose unity was not grounded on material circumstances, on the development of technology. It was grounded partly on a certain idea of justice. There was a very strong anarchist component in this sense, or justicialist component, we could say in a more Argentinian language. But this was, in its turn, also grounded in a common faith. We all remember the photos. No, the younger people will not remember that. I remember the photos of Lech Wałęsa with the Virgin of Częstochowa on his jacket. Not only Lech, all. The vast majority of the people participating saw in the idea of solidarity a social transposition of the Christian idea of communio. Solidarity was communio in action. Of course, the movement was open to people who had no religious convictions, but nevertheless, it would not have been possible without a grounding in this common faith, in this common idea of communio. I am interested in your destiny. You are part of me. You and I are one and the same. And we can assume the responsibility for the destiny of the nation just because of our unity. Something similar can be found in Argentinian history. The Argentinian workers' movement had a very strong anarchist component, and in 1944, between 1945 and 1950, they explicitly adopted Christian social doctrine as their background. Why am I saying this? After 1989, many people thought, well, communism has been defeated. We don't need any workers' movement anymore. The traditional proletariat does not exist anymore. Yes, there are some remnants now and then, but cannot pretend the social centrality that was assigned to it by the Marxist doctrine, and the workers of the world do not stand in need anymore of a defense. And we have had a terrible crisis of trade unions throughout the world. I think because the main model for the organization of trade unions was the idea of the proletarians and of a social development that would lead in time to the transformation of all workers in proletarians in the sense of people who have no particular skills, no particular religious conviction, no particular culture, who are fungible with one another. Everyone can take the place of any other one. And this is not what happened. On the contrary, we had a fragmentation of working tasks, and the factory as the place in which the proletarians had to become visible has been dissolved. We have small factories interconnected with one another in a network, and the workers do not work, most of them, one near to the other, side by side. How can we unite the workers? How can the workers become again protagonists of their own destiny? It seems to me that we need a different kind of trade union, a different kind of workers' movement that is not dependent at all on the supposed coaction of the technological development, that expresses what we could call a voluntarist moment that enters into the working process with an identity, and this can arise only in relation to a church that has the capacity of moving from the experience, from the ontological fact of the communio, with the idea that the communio must become a community, must become visible in a real community. It seems to me that this corresponds very much to what Pope Francis is asking in his speeches to the popular movements. What are popular movements? In part, they are something thoroughly new. People that, under the pressure of oppression, gather together. And they are weak, and they have no tradition, they have no organization. And for the popular movement, I think it is extremely important to get in touch with the traditional workers' movement, or with those parts of the traditional worker movements that still have an identity, that can be communicated to them, to forge an alliance between popular movements and trade unions. I think there is a task also for the meeting of Assisi. How can we start a dialogue, at least, and see if such an alliance can be created? Why do we need that? Because the power of the new dominating elite is largely dependent on the fragmentation of the people. We have no more people, the people in the sense of the populus Romanus. We are no more a people because we are not, we lack an element that can call us to be one part of the others, to be part of the same community. We need to reconstitute peoples. We are a liquid society, but a liquid society is not the end of history. Zygmunt Bauman, he was a former Marxist, but he was also a Polishman. And so he has this idea of the liquid society that is exactly the result of the workers' mass no more united through the compulsion of the productive, the mode of production, and then set free each one in his isolation. But the same Zygmunt Bauman has some beautiful pages on what brings people together. It is a little bit romantic, but it was a polishment. It is love. Love as the experience of entering one in the life of the other, of the discovery of my identity and the relation with you. That is romantic, but has an Eucharistic undertone. That's the point. The atomization of society, the destruction of civil society, is the precondition for the new kind of power. The new kind of power is absolutely strong because dominates a society in which there are masses but no more communities. That is thoroughly liquid. And before asking ourselves what should be done, we should ask ourselves, is it possible to constitute a subject that will do that? Because it is apparent that what should be done does not correspond to the interests of the dominating elite of today, making a distinction between the... My goodness, did I already talk so long?
We have another 15 minutes.
Ah, well, good, thanks God. And making one distinction. There is a dominating elite that controls the new information and communication technology, and therefore can influence also political elections and the national dominating elites. And there are dominating elites that live within a time constriction. Politics today is limited to thinking what will happen in 6 months. We have no more visions. And of course, in order to assume the control of the future of mankind, or to try to assume not a control, a responsibility for the future of mankind, you need to have a vision that goes beyond 6 months, that extends to the next at least 20 years. And this cannot be produced in this situation, where the main theme is the break between elites and people. The people do not trust the elites. The elites have knowledge, but they very often have used their knowledge for their own profit, or they have not been able to bring about the promised changes, and the result is what we call today populism. Populism as the expression of a society that has lost consistency and in which a social desperation grows. Perhaps the best description of this situation can be found in the 8th book of the Republic of Plato. Plato says that when the moral relativists, well, he uses the word sophists, when the sophists get the power of the state, then they make use of the power for their private interest. And then the people lose confidence in the institutions. And when the people loses confidence in the institutions, they are ready to follow the first demagogue who passes by, whatever the kind of flag he waves in the wind. It may be a red flag, it may be a black flag, it may be a gray flag, it may be a right-wing populist, a left-wing populist, does not really matter. We have many such populist movements in Europe and in Latin America. I think we should not despise these movements. We should rather ask the question, what can we do with them? What is the problem? They repeat the suffering of the people. The people suffer, and the populist movements repeat the suffering of the people. But they do not have answers. How could they have answers? They did not study in the London School of Economics, in Harvard, or in Tübingen, or in Pamplona, or whatever. They cannot have answers. Can we think of an education of elites who are rooted in the people, popular elites? How can a populist movement become popular when they have elites who belong to the people, who feel that they are people, and that at the same time they have the needed knowledge. I remember really Solidarność did not begin when Lech Wałęsa enters into the dockyards of Danzig. That was a beginning, but there was a second beginning. When the intellectuals of the Club of Catholic Intellectuals of Warsaw, they asked to enter, to be admitted in, to pass through the gates of the dockyards, and they are received and accepted, and they constituted the committee of the consultative council of the trade union Solidarność. Then you have the unity of intellectuals and people, and this is a force. It is like an atom bomb. If you have two different parts, two different blocks of uranium, they will not explode. If you put them together, then you have an atomic explosion. The unity of intellectuals and people was the beginning of a movement that has changed the face of the world. I wonder whether we should not ask ourselves, what can we do? We are the intellectuals. Each one of us is elite. How popular are we? Can we be popular? I remember, I don't know how many of you were here when we had a disastrous meeting of the Academy with Correa, Grabois, and Morales. No? It was a disaster. In particular, I remember Margaret Archer was furious. You remember, Paolo? And it was, I found it was very funny, no? It was funny, indeed. The alliance was not concluded. We passed by, and we did not fall in love with each other. But the intention of the Pope, because I think the Pope imposed that invitation, was perhaps to call us to this possibility. How can we become popular, and how can we help the growth of an elite that is popular? In the history of my country, the best and perhaps the only real ruling elite, there is a difference between a dominating elite and a ruling elite. The only ruling elite that we have had came from the Christian Democratic Party and from, materially, from the Catholic Action. Millions of people who had been educated to have common values and who offered a very large ruling class. The idea of democracy is that the ruling class and the people coincide. Of course, this is a transcendental ideal. It cannot be realized. But the broader the ruling class, the nearer you come to this ideal. It was a very broad ruling class with organized and with the capacity to express some individualities that had a very high cultural level. It was the unity of the intellectuals and the people. If we want to think of a subject that is at the level of the challenge of today, I think we have to make a reflection on the workers' movement or on the popular movements or on the union of workers and popular movements on the one hand, and on the other hand, on the task of the church in giving to this movement the needed inspiration, the needed background of the formation of communal personalities who feel that they belong to the people. I am an attentive reader, sometimes also critical, but attentive reader of the works of Pierpaolo Donati. And, well, it seems to me that this corresponds very much to what you mean when you speak of relation. What is a relation? A relation is exactly the fact that I can understand my identity only in relation with others. Which others? My family, my parents, my wife, my fellow workers, my nation, Europe, mankind. In it's not only a hierarchical order, it is an intermingling of different forms of pertaining to one another that constitute in the end the reality that Pope Francis calls people. It is a mythical reality. It would be interesting to dwell on what is a mythical reality in the language of Pope Francis. Well, listening to you, I always ask myself, well, how many interesting things, how many things could be done? Who will do them? What can we do in order to help a process? Because if you think, because another way of understanding the function of an academy like ours is that of thinking we are the counselors of the prince. We produce ideas, and the prince, the governors, the leading elites, the governments, the church, I don't know who, they will take care of it.
Still 5 minutes.
Still 5 minutes, good. I think that this is perhaps not the best way to think this function. I think that Pope Francis has a very strong insistence now on the fact that we should put ourselves at the service of the people. What does it mean? I remember when I was a young boy, I have begun quoting Don Luigi Giussani, and I imagine that I shall end this intervention going back to Luigi Giussani again. He had an idea on what we need in order to educate young people. And he thought that there are 3 elements extremely important. One is the liturgy, one is culture, and we have the second element, and the third one is charity. We spent a lot of time with poor people and poor boroughs, not with the pretension of giving solutions to their problems, well, with the idea of helping, of course, in so far as possible, but with the idea of becoming friends, of entering into their life, of making an experience of communion with them, that is, learning that we belong to them and they belong to us. A popular elite grows when you have people that make this experience. Cultural excellence, for Christians also liturgical life, and the participation to the life of the people. When I see the cultural programs that we have in our universities today, I find that 2 of the 3 elements are missing. And this is the reason why it is also so difficult to enter with the students into an educational alliance. That is, to gather their attention and the engagement of all their forces, their intellectual forces, into a program. And we run the risk of losing the best, who, after all, ask themselves the question, why should we do that? Only for money? Is it worth the while to enter into the hardships of a real cultural education only for money, or for what else? So I stop here. I am glad that I have not used it all the time. And I hope that this can give you more food for thought than if I had read my paper, that in any case is at your disposal on that table.